Welcome to the deep dive. We take a pile of academic research and, well, boil it down for you. Today we're getting into some heavy territory. Political crime and terrorism. Our mission really is to cut through the noise. We're using these sources to get clear definitions, figure out what separates, say, a political criminal from a terrorist, understand the motivations, and see how these groups actually work.
Absolutely. And getting that distinction clear is, I think, really important for you, the listener. These terms get thrown around and blurred all the time. What the source material gives us is a framework. It helps us look not just at what the acts are, but how the people doing them think, how they rationalize things, designed to, tear down society.
Okay, let's start unpacking that. The broadest category first. Political crime. The sources are pretty clear here. Illegal acts specifically aimed at undermining a government, threatening its survival. The key thing isn't just the crime itself. It could be anything. Really, it's the intent, right? The goal is to challenge or overthrow the state.
Exactly. And what makes these individuals, these political criminals, different from, say, a common thief is the why. The sources really stress this. They often see themselves as driven by principle or faith, maybe a deep conviction. They talk about a higher calling.
Right, a higher calling, unlike someone just out for cash.
Well, that's where it gets interesting. The goals can range from intimidation, sparking a revolution, spreading their beliefs, but also profit. And the sources make this really insightful point, differentiating conviction from pseudo-conviction.
Okay, what's the difference there?
True conviction is, genuine belief in the ideology. But pseudo-conviction, that's using the idea of a higher calling, the ideology, as a kind of mask. It hides self-interest, maybe a power grab, or sometimes just plain old personal profit. And you see this blurring ideology and self-interest popping up again and again in the research.
Huh, okay. And the actual types of political crimes, the list is pretty broad. Anything intended to mess with the political process. We're talking like election fraud, public corruption.
Abuse of office, yeah.
Treason, espionage.
Right.
And importantly, the sources highlight state political crime.
That's when the government itself turns criminal, essentially, using illegal acts against its own people.
Like torture.
Exactly. Torture, illegal surveillance, oppression, all to hold on to power. It's like the ultimate betrayal of trust. And it's a perfect example of that pseudo-conviction we talked about, justifying anything to maintain power.
You know, what I found really compelling in the sources was this idea of a cognitive path, a kind of mental journey someone takes to become a political criminal. It lays out 4 stages, common stages that people seem to go through. Can you walk us through that, especially how it lets the person sort of absolve themselves?
Yeah, it's basically a roadmap to dehumanizing the target. And it happens incrementally in these stages.
Right.
Stage 1 is pretty mild, just noticing something isn't right. It's not right. Simple observation.
Okay.
Stage 2 brings in more emotion. It's not fair. There's a sense of grievance now. It's personal.
Right.
But the big shift, the really crucial one, is stage 3. It's your fault.
Assigning blame.
Precisely. The target, whether it's the government, a specific group, whatever, is now identified as the cause of the problem, the source of the unfairness.
And stage 4, that's where things get dangerous.
That's the final step. You're evil. The target has to be completely stripped of any moral legitimacy. They're not just wrong or unfair. They are fundamentally evil. And achieving that mental state, that condemnation, seems to be the psychological green light needed to rationalize serious violence, illegal acts, even atrocities against them.
Okay, so if political crimes, this broad category of acts against the state, how does terrorism fit in? What makes it distinct? Let's look at that specific U.S. State Department definition the sources use.
Yeah, the definition is very precise, and the key is the target. It defines terrorism as premeditated, politically motivated violence against non-combatant targets.
Non-combatants, civilians, basically.
Right, by subnational groups or clandestine agents. And the intent is usually to influence a wider audience, not just the immediate victims. International terrorism just means it crosses borders, involves citizens or territory of more than one country.
So, hitting civilian targets deliberately to send a message, to scare people. That's the core of terrorism, setting it apart.
Exactly.
But, in modern conflicts, isn't that line between combatant and non-combatant sometimes fuzzy? Do the sources get into that gray area? Like, what about a worker in a defense contractor's factory?
They acknowledge it's complex, definitely, but the framework maintains that classic distinction, partly by clarifying who terrorists aren't. They differentiate them from related groups.
Like who?
Like guerrillas. Guerrillas tend to focus on military or police targets, often in rural areas. They might hope to eventually become a regular army.
Okay, so they fight like soldiers, mostly.
More or less. Then you have insurgents. Their goal is usually about territorial control, maybe taking over part or all of a country or forcing the government to make big political changes. They try to win over the population, compete for support.
Trying to be the new government, in a way.
Yeah, essentially. And a revolutionary. That implies more of a civil war scenario. A direct fight between organized forces could be nationalists against a colonial power, or two factions fighting for control of the existing state.
Got it. So the terrorist, by contrast, isn't usually trying to win a conventional fight. They use shock, fear, hitting those soft targets, precisely because they often can't win a straight-up military fight.
That's the core tactic, and if you look back historically, it's fascinating how the motives evolved. The sources point out that the earliest forms of what we might call terrorism actually had religious roots.
Religious, not political.
Initially, yeah. Minority religious groups using violence to demand the right to practice their faith or even to establish its dominance.
Wow, so the idea of using violence for faith came before using it for political rights.
It seems so, based on the historical accounts. The political roots grew stronger later, especially when rulers held absolute power. Violence was seen by some as, well, one of the few ways to demand political change.
And the actual word terrorist, where did that come from?
Fun fact from the sources, it really gained traction during the French Revolution, specifically referring to the state violence during the Reign of Terror, which started around 1795.
The state itself being the terrorist, it comes full circle.
It does. Now, bringing it to the present day, the sources categorize contemporary terrorism into several types based on their goals and methods. Instead of running through a whole list, let's maybe focus on a couple that seem particularly dominant now.
Good idea. Which ones stand out?
Well, nationalist terrorism is a big one. This is typically driven by groups representing a minority, ethnic or religious, that feels persecuted and wants its own independent state, its own homeland. It's rooted in grievance, feeling oppressed by the majority.
That sounds like it connects right back to that cognitive stage 3. It's your fault. Blaming the state for the group's problems.
Absolutely. Then, as we mentioned, there's state-sponsored terrorism. That's the regime using terror tactics against its own people or supporting external groups to do its dirty work.
And what about individuals acting alone?
Right, the lone actor or lone wolf terrorist. This is someone who is inspired by a group's ideology, admires them, but isn't actually getting direct orders or support. They act independently, which makes them incredibly hard to detect beforehand.
Scary stuff. And how do the larger groups actually stay operational? How do they avoid getting caught?
Organization is key for survival. The sources talk about networks or hierarchies, but the really critical structure is the terror cell.
Cells, like compartments.
Exactly, functionally independent units. People in one cell usually know very little, maybe nothing, about who's in other cells or what they're doing. So if one cell gets compromised, gets caught, it doesn't necessarily take down the whole network. It provides a lot of security.
Makes sense. Which brings us back to the fundamental question, why? Why does someone join a cell or decide to become a lone actor? The motivations must be complex.
Hugely complex, and the sources reflect that. There isn't one single answer, more like multiple overlapping factors.
Okay, like what are the main perspectives?
Well, there's the psychological view. This suggests some individuals might be emotionally disturbed in some way, and the group provides an outlet for their internal issues, their psychoses, within a violent context.
Okay.
What else? Then there's the alienation view. This one feels particularly relevant today. It suggests a link, a positive correlation between, say, lack of economic opportunity, bad economies, recessions, and people becoming more vulnerable to terrorist recruitment, feeling left out, alienated.
That makes intuitive sense. Desperation breeding extremism.
It's certainly a factor the sources highlight. They also mention things like family conflict playing a role or the broader political environment, especially the existence of failed states, places where the government is weak or non-existent. That creates a vacuum.
So personal problems, economic hardship, political chaos.
But maybe the most powerful driver, according to some of this research, is the socialization friendship view. Yeah. Simple group dynamics, intense loyalty, solidarity within the group. Sometimes people get drawn in simply because a friend joined and they don't want to lose that connection or they feel pressure not to let the group down. It's about belonging.
Wow. The power of peer pressure, even in extremism.
Absolutely. And underpinning all of this, often, is the ideological view. the pull of extreme beliefs, whether religious or political. Religious fanaticism is a potent force identified in the sources.
And for state-sponsored terrorism, the motivation seems a bit different.
Well, it circles back to what we discussed. Repressive regimes use ideology strategically to dehumanize whoever they're targeting. Remember, stage 4, you're evil. They push propaganda, create this huge psychological distance between their supporters and the people they're terrorizing. It makes the violence seem necessary, even acceptable, to those carrying it out or supporting the regime.
Okay, so we've defined the terms, looked at the cognitive path, the history, the organization, the motivations. What about the scale of the threat now? And how are we responding? The sources indicate that, unfortunately, global terrorism is still very much a reality, and the data they cite from the START Consortium, that's the National Consortium for the Study of Terrorism and Responses to Terrorism, actually shows that both attacks and fatalities have gone up recently.
Yeah, that's a sobering point in the research, and it highlights that persistent problem. You might eliminate one leader, but the group, whether it's a hierarchy or a network, often just replaces them. It keeps going.
So the response has to be pretty comprehensive.
It has to be multi-pronged, definitely. The sources outline several layers. You've got the direct law enforcement approach, federal agencies, FBI, CIA, and crucially, the Department of Homeland Security, DHS, which was created specifically for this.
Right. Boots on the ground, intelligence gathering.
Then there's the legal framework. The sources mention specific laws like the USAPA, that's the big one after 9/11, the Patriot Act.
Officially, the Uniting and Strengthening America by providing appropriate tools required to intercept and obey Terrorism Act. Quite a mouthful.
It is, and more recently, things like the USA Freedom Act. These laws give the government expanded powers for surveillance, investigation, prosecution of terrorism-related activities.
Okay, so law enforcement and legal tools. What else?
The third, and maybe the trickiest leg, is politics. The sources argue that a key long-term strategy involved tackling the support for these groups
How do you do that?
by addressing the conditions that allow them to flourish. Things like being constructive partners internationally, maybe nation-building efforts, providing aid to countries where these groups operate, trying to undercut the grievances, the narrative that attracts recruits in the first place.
So trying to fix the it's not fair problem, basically.
Exactly. It's recognizing that if the root causes, the deep-seated grievances, aren't addressed, then just fighting the symptoms, the violence itself, is unlikely to ever fully succeed. You have to tackle why people feel compelled to join in the first place.
Right. Well, this has been quite a deep dive. We started by separating political crime, driven by things like profit, conviction, or revolution, from terrorism, which is really defined by that specific awful tactic, targeting noncombatants to create fear and influence. And we saw how that cognitive journey, especially that final stage of dehumanizing the other, is so critical to enabling violence.
And if we bring it back to what the sources identify as a major driver of current threats, particularly that nationalist terrorism, groups feeling persecuted, demanding a homeland, it really does raise a fundamental question about how we respond effectively. If understanding the roots, like the sources urge us to do, is paramount, then maybe the most effective solutions have to be political at their core.
Which leads us to our final thought for you this week, something to consider. If a lot of this nationalist terrorism really does stem from these deep feelings of persecution among minority groups, could the best long-term counterterrorism strategy actually involve finding better ways to make sure these groups feel heard? Could implementing programs to genuinely integrate their concerns into the political system, address those root grievances before they explode into violence, be the most effective path? Something to think about.